A child shouldn't have to make those decisions. A child's brain isn't equipped to handle that. A child needs both parents. A child needs to love freely without guilt. But when you grow up having to choose sides, something inside fractures. Something breaks that's hard to fix. People who had to choose sides often grow up to be adults who are terrified of loyalty conflicts. They're people who can't be neutral. They can't see gray. Everything has to be black and white. Someone is all good or all bad. There's no middle ground, because that's how they learned to survive, by making clear distinctions, by knowing exactly who was safe and who wasn't. The problem is that this framework doesn't work in adult relationships, because real people are complicated. Real people contain contradictions. Real people can be both good and harmful. But the person who had to choose sides as a child doesn't know how to process that. They panic when someone they love disappoints them. They panic when someone they're supposed to trust hurts them, because in their internal map, that doesn't make sense. People are either safe or dangerous. They don't get to be both. This creates a very specific relational pattern. These adults often find themselves in relationships where they're constantly waiting for the other person to reveal which side they're actually on. Are they the good one or the bad one? And they're hypervigilant for any sign that they've chosen wrong. Any small mistake becomes evidence. Any disappointment becomes proof that they've made a terrible error in judgment, that they've chosen the wrong side again. What's really painful is how this affects their sense of trust. They struggle to trust their own judgment, because at some point in their past, they thought they'd made the right choice. They'd picked the good parent, they'd picked the safe one. And then something happened that made them question that. Maybe they learned things they weren't supposed to know. Maybe the parent they'd sided with did something terrible. Maybe they realized they'd betrayed the other parent unfairly. And they learned the hard way that their judgment couldn't be trusted, that they could get it wrong. So these adults become hypervigilant about making mistakes in relationships. They're constantly scanning for signs that they've chosen the wrong person to trust. They're waiting for betrayal. They're waiting to discover that the person they've aligned with is actually bad. And this hypervigilance exhausts everyone around them, because no one can live up to that level of scrutiny. No one can be perfect enough to never trigger that fear. People who had to choose sides also tend to struggle with a specific kind of guilt, survivor's guilt almost, because in choosing one parent, they implicitly rejected the other, and even as adults they carry that guilt. They feel like they betrayed someone. They feel like they owed loyalty to the parent who lost them. They feel like they made the wrong choice, or they hate themselves for making the choice they made. This guilt often comes out sideways. It comes out as resentment toward the parent they chose, because they resent that parent for putting them in that position, for making them choose, for making them feel guilty about their own survival. The other pattern that emerges is that these adults become compulsive diplomats. They become mediators. They become the person who tries to keep the peace between conflicting parties, because they learned early that their job was to manage adult emotions. Their job was to navigate between two sides. Their job was to make sure no one was too angry at them. So they developed this almost supernatural ability to see both sides, to understand both perspectives, to find the middle ground. Which sounds healthy, but it's not, because it comes from a place of fear, not wisdom. These diplomats often end up in relationships where they're doing all the emotional labor. They're the ones keeping track of everyone's feelings. They're the ones managing conflicts. They're the ones making sure no one gets hurt. And they attract people who are okay with that dynamic because it serves them. So they end up in relationships that are deeply unbalanced, where they're giving constantly and getting very little in return. Here's what's also true. People who had to choose sides often have a hard time with their own anger, because anger is dangerous when you're a child caught between two people. Anger toward one side means you're not loyal to them anymore. Anger toward the other side means you're betraying your choice. So anger has to be suppressed, has to be hidden, has to be transformed into something else, into people-pleasing, into perfectionism, into anxiety, into depression, but not raw, honest anger. And then, as adults, they encounter situations where they need to be angry. They need to set boundaries. They need to express that something hurt them, but they don't know how. The anger comes out sideways. It comes out as silent treatment, as passive aggression, as sudden emotional distance, because direct conflict feels too dangerous. Direct conflict reminds them of the original conflict, the one they had to choose a side in. People who had to choose sides also tend to have a very complicated relationship with fairness. They're obsessed with fairness, with making sure everyone gets treated equally, with ensuring that they're not showing favoritism because they learned the cost of favoritism. They learned what it meant to be the rejected parent. They learned how it felt to know that your child had chosen the other parent. So they overcompensate. They bend over backward to be fair to everyone, even when fairness isn't the right approach, even when someone deserves consequences, even when setting a boundary would be the healthy thing. This sometimes manifests as them being unable to prioritize themselves, because prioritizing themselves feels like showing favoritism. It feels like choosing a side. They've learned that they have to be equally available to everyone, equally helpful, equally supportive. And if they prioritize their own needs, they're being unfair. They're being selfish. They're choosing sides. The deepest wound here is about divided loyalty. These people grew up believing that loyalty is a limited resource, that you can't fully love two people, that loving one person means betraying the other, and they carry this belief into adulthood. They have trouble being close to multiple people. They have trouble having healthy friendships and relationships simultaneously because in their mind, that's showing favoritism. That's dividing their loyalty. That's choosing sides. So they often end up isolated, or they end up in relationships where they're expected to cut everyone else off to prove their loyalty by abandoning other connections. This wound also shows up in how they handle conflict in their own relationships. When conflict happens, when disagreement happens, they feel panic. Because conflict means someone's in the wrong, someone's the bad guy, someone's the side they should be on, and they have to figure out which one. They have to make a choice, and making that choice feels like betrayal. It feels like abandonment. It feels dangerous. So they either avoid conflict at all costs, they become conflict avoidant to the point of dysfunction. They'll accept mistreatment rather than create conflict. They'll sacrifice their own needs rather than have an argument. Or they go the other direction. They become hypercritical. They become judgmental. They become the person who's constantly evaluating everyone around them, deciding who's in and who's out, because they learned that life is about choosing sides, and they're trying to make sure they choose right this time. Now, we need to look at what actually created this wound, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Children don't naturally develop this framework, they learn it. And they learn it in very specific circumstances, when the adults around them put them in a position where they had to choose, where loyalty was demanded, where being loved by one person meant rejecting another. Sometimes it happens explicitly, adults fighting directly in front of the child, adults asking the child to take a side. Whose fault is this? Who do you believe? Do you want to stay with your mother or your father? Sometimes it happens through narratives. One parent telling the child terrible things about the other parent, painting them as dangerous or selfish or cruel, and the child has to decide whether to believe the parent they love or protect the parent they're being told is bad. Sometimes it's more subtle. A parent withdrawing if the child is close to the other parent. A parent making the child responsible for their emotional well-being. You're the only one who loves me. You're the only one who understands. A parent triangulating the child into their conflict with the other parent, using the child as a messenger, using the child to negotiate, using the child as proof of wrongdoing. And sometimes it's about choosing which version of reality to accept. A child knowing something happened, seeing something, experiencing something, but the adults around them telling them it didn't happen, telling them they're making it up, telling them they're overreacting. So the child has to choose between their own perception and the adult's version of reality. And when you choose the adult's version, you're choosing to betray yourself. The impact of this carries into adulthood in very specific ways. These adults struggle with their own sense of reality. They struggle to trust their own perceptions because they learned early that their perception might be wrong, that what they saw or felt might be a misinterpretation, that the adult's version of reality is the correct one. So they second-guess themselves constantly. They doubt their own experiences. They look to other people to confirm whether they're crazy or not. Most importantly, it requires grieving what you lost. Grieving the childhood you should have had, the innocence you should have gotten to keep, the right to love freely without guilt, the right to not have to choose, because that's what was stolen from you, the ability to be a child. And that loss is real, and it's worth acknowledging. If this resonates, if you're recognizing the patterns in yourself, if you're seeing how the wound of choosing sides has shaped your relationships, your sense of self, your ability to trust, that awareness is the beginning. Because once you see it, you can start to question it. You can start to notice when you're applying that old framework to situations that don't require it. You can start to practice seeing the gray. You can start to practice loyalty without exclusivity. You can start to practice trusting your own perception again. Understanding these patterns, understanding how childhood wounds shape adult behavior, that's what we're doing here at The Forgotten Self. We're looking at the psychology of the parts of us that got hurt early, the parts that learned survival mechanisms we're still using in situations where we don't need them. If this helped you see something about yourself, if it cracked something open, subscribe, because we're building a community where these wounds get named, where the patterns become visible, where the healing can actually begin. Until next time, practice trusting yourself, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard.